Hey, crew. It's Pitt, and I'm back with a little more psychology. Today, we are diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Psychology and the Occult. We will be reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the box down below, along with the original source material, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. If you find value, I ask that you do all of the wonderful things down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Throw me a comment whether you agree or disagree with anything that is stated. If you put it in the box and it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you truly find value, I ask that you hit the super thanks or super chat. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of one of my books. The most relevant to today is going to be the one in the middle, The Green Stone. It is my work with spiritual alchemy. It is what I consider to be the completion of Carl Jung's Mysterium Conjunctionis and his work with the archetypes, because I have completely reworked the MBTI system. Or you can reach out to me directly through the links provided down below. For whatever purpose you would like. With all of that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of psychology and the occult. I did not realize when I closed, I don't read this ahead. I scan to see where a good breaking point will be, right? And I was planning on getting to the end of part 3. I didn't realize that part 4 is only 2 paragraphs long. And so we will pick that up, finish it off, and then we're going to jump into the next 2 parts. Hopefully, we will get both of them done today. So, for the conclusion, this exhausts my knowledge of the sources used by the patient. Where the root idea came from, she was unable to say. Naturally, I waded through the occult literature so far as it pertained to this subject and discovered a wealth of parallels with our Gnostic system, dating from different centuries, but scattered about in all kinds of work, most of them quite inaccessible to the patient. Moreover, at her tender age and in her surroundings, the possibility of any such study must be ruled out of account. A brief survey of the system, in the light of the patient's own explanations, will show how much intelligence was expended on its construction. How high the intellectual achievement is to be rated must remain a matter of taste. At all events, considering the youth and mentality of the patient, it must be regarded as something quite out of the ordinary. In conclusion, I would like to express my warmest thanks to my revered teacher, Professor Bleuler, for his friendly encouragement in the loan of the books, and to my friend, Dr. Ludwig van Meralt, for his kindness in handing over to me the first case mentioned in this book, the case of Mrs. E. All right, now we will be diving into On Spiritualistic Phenomena. Once again, most of the footnotes are going to be just references to other works and things along that nature. So we're not going to take the time to jump between them. If anything seems to be a little bit confusing and it has a footnote, then we will dive in. All right. It is impossible within the short space of a lecture to say anything fundamental about such a complicated historical and psychological problem as spiritualism appears to be. One must content oneself with shedding a little light on one or the other aspect of this intricate question. This kind of approach will at least give the hearer an approximate idea of the many facets of spiritualism. Spiritualism, as well as being a theory, its advocates call it scientific, is a religious belief which, like every religious belief, forms the spiritual core of a religious movement. This sect believes in the actual and tangible intervention of a spiritual world in our world, and consequently makes a religious practice of communicating with the spirits. The dual nature of spiritualism gives it an advantage over other religious movements. Not only does it believe in certain articles of faith that are not susceptible to proof, but it bases its belief on a body of allegedly scientific psychical phenomena, which are physical phenomena, which are supposed to be of such a nature that they cannot be explained, except by the activity of spirits. Because of its dual nature, on the one side a religious sect, on the other a scientific hypothesis, spiritualism touches upon widely differing areas of life that would seem to have nothing in common. Spiritualism as a sect originated in America in the year 1848. The story of its origin is a strange one. Two girls of the Methodist family Fox in Hydesville, near Rochester, New York, were frightened every night by the sounds of knocking. At first, a great scandal arose because the neighbors suspected that the devil was up to his usual tricks. Gradually, however, communication was established with the knocking sounds when it was discovered that questions were answered with a definite number of knocks. With the help of a knocking alphabet, it was learned that a man was murdered in the Fox's house and his body buried in the cellar. Investigations were said to have confirmed this. Thus far, the report. The public performances given by the Foxes with the poltergeists were quickly followed by the founding of another of other sects. Table turning, much practiced earlier, was taken up again. Numerous mediums were sought and found, that is, persons in whose presence such phenomena as knocking noises occurred. The movement spread rapidly to England and the continent. In Europe, spiritualism took the form chiefly of an epidemic of table turning. There was hardly an evening party or dance where the guests did not steal away at a late hour to question the table. This particular symptom of spiritualism was rampant everywhere. The religious sects made less headway, but they continue to grow steadily. In every big city today, there is a fairly large community of practicing spiritualists. In America, which swarms with local religious movements, the rise of spiritualism is understandable enough. With us, its favorable reception can be explained only by the fact that the ground had been historically prepared. The beginning of the 19th century had brought us the Romantic movement in literature, a symptom of widespread, deep seated longing for anything extraordinary and abnormal. People adored wallowing in oceanic emotions. They went crazy over novels set in old castles and ruined cloisters. Everywhere prominence was given to the mystical, the hysterical. Lectures about life after death, about sleepwalkers and visionaries, about animal magnetism and mesmerism were the order of the day. Schopenhauer devoted a long chapter to all these things in his Pererega und Paralapomena, and he also spoke of them in various places in his Chef d'oeuvre. Chef d'oeuvre. Even his important concept of sanctity is a far-fetched mystico-aesthetic ideal. Similar movements made themselves felt in the Catholic Church, clustering around the strange figure of Johann Joseph von Gores, 1776 to 1848. Especially significant in this respect is his four-volume work, Die Christliche Mystik, Rogenberg, 1836 to 42. The same trends appear in his earlier book, Immanuel Swedenborg, Sein Visionen und sein Wert Autoris zur Kirche, Spire, 1827. The Protestant public raved about the soulful poetry of Justinus Kerner and his clairvoyant Frau Friedrich Hof, while certain theologians gave vent to their Catholicizing tendencies by excommunicating spirits. From this period, too, came a large number of remarkable psychological descriptions of abnormal people, ecstatic, somnambulist, sensitives. They were much in demand and were cultivated assiduously. A good example was Frau Hof herself, the clairvoyante of Prevost, and the circle of admirers who gathered round her. Her Catholic counterpart was Katharina Emmerich, the ecstatic nun of Dolmen. Reports of similar personalities were collected together in a weighty tome by an anonymous savant entitled The Ecstatic Virgins of Tyrol, Guiding Stars in the Dark Firmament of Mysticism. When the strange personages were investigated, the following suprasensible processes were observed. 1. Magnetic phenomena. 2. Clairvoyance and prophecy. 3. Visions. 1. Animal magnetism, as understood at the beginning of the 19th century, covered a vaguely defined area of physiological and psychological phenomena, which, it was thought, could all be explained as magnetic. Animal magnetism had been in the air ever since the brilliant experiments of Franz Anton Mesmer. It was Mesmer who discovered the art of putting people to sleep by light passes of the hand. In some people, this sleep was like the natural one. In others, it was a waking sleep. That is, they were like sleepwalkers. Only part of them was asleep, while some senses remained awake. This half sleep was also called magnetic sleep or somnambulism. People in these states were wholly under the will of the magnetist. They were magnetized by him. Today, as we know, there is nothing wonderful about these states. They are known as hypnosis, and we use the mesmeric passes as a valuable adjunct to other methods of suggestion. Then that is wonderful, right? It is wonderful that you can do this procedure and put somebody into a state where you can make suggestions that will help them to achieve things in their life. That is wonderful, right? Then it may not be supernatural, it may not be outside of the realms of explainability, but at one point it absolutely was. But it was still a thing. There was still hypnosis before Mesmer discovered and let people know, right? There were secret clubs that practiced these things. There were priesthoods that did these things, almost certainly, right? If it is a possibility, somebody in one of the churches, not even claiming any one particular one, in one of the churches would have found it and they would have used it to their advantage. Some emperor or tyrant throughout history would have had a wise man who could have done it. And it was kept secret and passed down in sects, and only certain people got to know. And then one day, Mesmer figured it out. And Mesmer let everybody know. And now it is common knowledge. And now there is nothing wonderful about it. But at one point in time, it was literal fucking magic. It was. There is no way around that. There is somebody was able to take and influence somebody by passing a hand in front of their eyes and speaking words in a certain tone. That is magic. eh? And so that was wonderful. Just because you have an explanation for it now doesn't make it less wonderful. It is central heating is wonderful. Refrigeration is wonderful. The ability to travel faster than walking or riding a horse is wonderful. It doesn't matter that we know the explanation now, it is still something that should bring wonder at least every once in a while. Right? Every once in a while, you should stop and show some appreciation for we've really come a long way in the last 100 years. We've got running water that you can just turn a little spigot and it comes on and it's clean. And you can drink that and not have to worry about shitting your guts out. That is wonderful. You can stand in running hot, clean water, water that people in other parts of the world would literally kill people over. And you get to bathe in it. You get to piss in it. You get to shit in clean water. Do you know what a luxury that is in history? 100 years ago, nobody had ever had a hot shower. And now it is so commonplace that people just take it for granted. 100 years ago, the infant mortality rate was over 50%. And now your children will probably live to adulthood, and people just take it for granted. That is wild to me, right? I try to express those things because it is important to understand that. Yeah. So, yeah, we may know the mechanics behind it, but that doesn't make it less wonderful. It is wonderful. The significance attributed to the passes quickly led to their being grossly overestimated. And the thing is that there are still things that we do not know. We make guesses, we assume, we have hypotheses, we have working theories, but we don't know. Like gravity is still a very much an unknown. Other than if you throw it up, it'll come down. Some of the mechanics of gravity are a little bit fucky. Right? They are a little bit thrown off, and there is something about it that we don't quite have right yet. We have some of the things right. We understand that there are things, at least, right? The four fundamental forces of nature. We know that that is a thing now. We have labels for them, but we really don't understand how electricity really works. Like Electricity doesn't work without a return to source, right? You have to have a ground on your plug that you stick in the wall, or else your whatever is not going to work. But your house doesn't have that. It's stuck in the ground, like the literal ground. It's not returning to the actual source in any way that we can visibly or perceptibly discern, but yet it works. And so there is something still, as of yet, we don't quite have about the mechanics of those four fundamentals and how they work together. And that is important to realize, right? That is still wonderful to us. It is still wonderful that gravity works in the way that it does. It is wonderful that electricity is even able to be harnessed with the lack of knowledge that we really have about it. All right. The significance attributed to the past has quickly led to their being grossly overestimated. People thought that some vitalistic force had been discovered. They spoke of a magnetic fluid that streamed from the magnetist into the patient and destroyed the diseased tissue. Let me look at this real quick. Uh, yeah, I think it's going to work. Okay. They also used it to explain the movements of the table in table turning, imagining that the table was vitalized by the laying on of hands and could therefore move about like a living thing. The phenomena of the divining rod and the automatically swinging pendulum were explained in the same way. Even completely crazy phenomena of this sort were widely reported and believed. Now, there is something to the divining rod. I mean, there is. You can dismiss some of the other things, but divining rods are still used today. I mean, people still use uh, divining rods. So I'm trying to think of the other term for it, and but it is still in use. Dowsing rods, right? People still use that today. I mean, whether it's the Y-shaped stick and finding water, or if it's metal rods and finding ore and oil, and that is a thing that happens on an industrial level, right? They send out these people with dowsing rods to find mines and the best location to drill for oil, and it works. So this is not just some idle speculation about, oh, these things seem to move. This is, hey, we've tested this repeatedly, not me personally, but as an industry, this is a thing. And so we cannot dismiss divining rods in the same way. Even the swinging pendulum is the same thing. The divining rod and the swinging pendulum are kind of interchangeable. If depends on what particular application you are using them for. And so there is something to it, right? What exactly it is, whether it is some kind of subconscious intuition, that is a possibility. I do not discount, but some of those get really hard to explain, right? Like, how do you decide that if you drill right here as opposed to right there, you're going to strike water or you're going to strike impenetrable rock? And you're right, right? And they test both sites, and you are right on both sites, right? There's something to it. That's all I'm saying. Back to the text. Thus, the new Prusche Zeitung reported from Barmen in Pomerania that a party of 7 persons sat themselves round a table in a boat and magnetized it. In the first 20 minutes, the boat drifted 50 feet downstream. Then it began to turn with steadily increasing speed until the rotary movement had carried it through an arc of 180 degrees in 3 minutes. Eventually, by skillful manipulation of the rudder, the boat moved forward, and the party traveled half a mile upstream in 40 minutes. But on the return journey, covered the same distance in 26 minutes. The crowd of spectators watching the experiment from the banks of the river received the table travelers with jubilation. Wait, they traveled half a mile upstream in 40 minutes, and the return journey covered the same distance in 26 minutes. So they're moving under power, I'm assuming, right? In the first 20 minutes, the boat drifted 50 feet downstream, and then it began to turn with steadily increasing speed until the movement had carried it through an arc of 180 degrees in 3 minutes. Now, without a relevant understanding of the size of this boat, It's going to be a little difficult to get into, right? But I was in the Navy. And one of the things that I did in the Navy during emergency services before I was part of the fire party, I was in after steering, which is the place where all the hydraulics to make the rudder move, right? That was one of the jobs that us engineers did, the enginemen in specificity. We maintained that the hydraulics for the aft steering, and part of what I had to do there was be there in case steering went out on the top and we were down on the bottom. And I can tell you that for my warship, it took considerably less time than 3 minutes to turn 180 degrees when the river catches you. Right? And so I don't know the size of this. Apparently, it was enough to have a party on. So maybe, party yacht size, or are we talking, you know, uh, like the American Queen steamboat size? There's a big difference in the turning radius and how it's going to make the mechanics work. So 3 minutes, according to this, is fairly well, right? So we're looking at probably a large vessel turning, moving upstream in 40 minutes and coming back down in 26 minutes, right? That's impressive because it probably should take you considerably longer than that to cover the distance going up than coming down as a ratio, because this is just over half. And the drag on the boat going up, I mean, there's a lot to this. A very mystical motorboat. And according to the report, the experiment had been suggested by Professor Nageli of Freiburg im Breisgau. Experiments in divination are known from the gray dawn of history. Thus, Amanius Marcellinus reports from AD 371 that a certain Patricus and Hilarius, living in the reign 364 to 78 of the Emperor Valens, had discovered by the abominable arts of soothsaying who would succeed to the throne. For this purpose, they used a metal bowl with the alphabet engraved round the rim. Over it, amid fearful oaths, they suspended a ring on a thread. This began to swing and spelt out the name Theodorus. When their magic was divulged, they were arrested and put to death. That is one of the primary discouragements for the exploration of these things, right? Especially once certain people got in charge, it became very dangerous to live outside of very, very narrow boxes for several millennia. So when magic was divulged, generally speaking, people were put to death. Ordinarily, experiments with the automatic movements of the table, the divining rod, and the pendulum are not as bizarre as the first example or as dangerous as the second. The various phenomena that may occur in table turning have been described in the treatise by Justinus Kerner, bearing the significant title, The Somnambulant Tables, A History and Explanation of These Phenomena, 1853. They have also been described by the late Professor Thury of Geneva in Les Tables Parlantes au point de vue de la physique générale, 1855. Point 2. Clairvoyance and prophecy are further characteristics of somnambulists. Clairvoyance in time and space plays a large role in the biography and description of these cases. The literature abounds in more or less credible reports, most of which have been collected by Gurney, Myers, and Podmore in their book, Phantasms of the Living, 1886. An excellent example of clairvoyance is preserved for us in philosophical literature and is especially interesting because it was personally commented on by Kant. In an undated letter to Charlotte von Noblick, he wrote as follows about the spirit seer Swedenborg. The following occurrence appears to me to have the greatest weight of proof, and to place the assertion respecting Swedenborg's extraordinary gift beyond all possibility of doubt. In the year 1759, towards the end of September, on Saturday at 4 o'clock p.m., Swedenborg arrived at Gothenburg from England, when Mr. William Castle invited him to his house, together with a party of 15 persons. About 6 o'clock, Swedenborg went out and returned to the company, quite pale and alarmed. He said that a dangerous fire had just broken out at Stockholm, at the Sodermalm. Gothenburg is about 50 German miles from Stockholm. and that it was spreading very fast. He was restless and went out often. He said that the house of one of his friends, whom he named, was already in ashes and that his own was in danger. At 8 o'clock, after we had been out again, he joyfully exclaimed, "Thank God! The fire is extinguished, the third door from my house." This news occasioned great commotion throughout the whole city, but particularly amongst the company in which he was. It was announced to the governor the same evening. On Sunday morning, Swedenborg was summoned to the governor, who questioned him concerning the disaster. Swedenborg described the fire precisely, how it had begun, and in what manner it had ceased, and how long it had continued. On the same day, the news spread through the city, and as the governor thought it worthy of attention, the consternation was considerably increased, because many were in trouble on account of their friends and property, which might have been involved in the disaster. On Monday evening, a messenger arrived at Gothenburg who was dispatched from the Board of Trade during the time of the fire. In the letters brought by him, the fire was described precisely in the manner stated by Swedenborg. On Tuesday morning, the royal courier arrived at the governor's with the melancholy intelligence of the fire, of the loss which it had occasioned, and of the houses that it damaged and ruined, not in the least differing from that which Swedenborg had given at the very time when it had happened, for the fire was extinguished at 8 o'clock. What can be brought forward against the authenticity of this occurrence? The conflagration in Stockholm. My friend who wrote this to me has examined all, not only in Stockholm, but also about 2 months ago in Gothenburg, where he is well acquainted with the most respectable houses and where he could obtain the most authentic and complete information. For, as only a very short time has elapsed since the 1759, most of the inhabitants are still alive who were eyewitnesses to this occurrence. Prophecy is a phenomenon so well known from the teachings of religion that there is no need to give any examples. 3. Visions have always figured largely in these miraculous tales, whether in the form of ghostly apparition or an ecstatic vision. Science regards visions as delusions of the senses, or hallucinations. Hallucinations are very common among the insane. Let me cite an example from the literature of psychiatry. A 24-year-old servant girl with an alcoholic father and a neurotic mother suddenly begins falling into peculiar states. From time to time, she falls into a state of consciousness in which she sees everything that comes into her mind vividly before her, as though it were there in reality. All the time, the images keep changing with breathtaking speed and lifelikeness. The patient, who in actual life is nothing but a simple country girl, then resembles an inspired seer. Her features become transfigured, her movements flow with grace. Famous figures pass before her mind's eye. Schiller appears to her in person and plays with her. He recites his poems to her. Then she herself begins to recite, improvising in verse the things she has read, experienced, and thought. Finally, she comes back to consciousness, tired and exhausted, with a headache and a feeling of oppression, and with only an indistinct memory of what had happened. At other times, her second consciousness has a somber character. She sees ghostly figures prophesying distant disaster, processions of spirits, caravans of strange and terrifying beast like forms, her own body being buried, etc. Visionary ecstasies are usually of this type. Numerous visionaries are known to us from history, among them many of the Old Testament prophets. There's a lot of problems with that. I have playlists if you are interested. There is the report of St. Paul's vision on the road to Damascus. I have a playlist if you are interested. Followed by a blindness that ceased at the psychological moment. This blindness reminds us, on the one hand, of the blindness which can be produced by suggestion, and on the other hand, of the blindness which occurs spontaneously with certain hysterical patients, and again disappears at a suitable psychological moment. The best visions, and the ones that are psychologically the most transparent, are found in the legends of the saints, the visions being the most colorful in the case of female saints experiencing the heavenly marriage. An outstanding visionary type was the Maid of Orleans, who was unconsciously imitated by the devout dreamer Thomas Ignaz Martin at the time of Louis the 18th. Swedenborg, a learned and highly intelligent man, was a visionary of unexampled fertility. His importance is attested by the fact that he had considerable influence on Kant. These remarks are not meant to be conclusive. They are only intended to sketch in broad outline the state of knowledge that at that time and its mystical tendency. They give some idea of the psychological premises which explain the rapid spread of American spiritualism in Europe. The table turning epidemic of the 50s has already been mentioned. It reached a climax in the 60s and 70s. In Paris, spiritualistic seances were held at the court of Napoleon III. Famous and sometimes infamous mediums appeared. Cumberland, the Davenport brothers, Holmes, Slade, Miss Cook. There was the real heyday of spiritualism, for these mediums produced marvelous phenomena, quite extraordinary things, went so far beyond the bounds of credibility that a thinking person who was not himself an eyewitness could only treat them with skepticism. The impossible happened. Human bodies and parts of bodies materialized out of thin air. Bodies that had an intelligence of their own and declared themselves to be the spirits of the dead. They complied with the doubting request of the worldlings and even submitted to experimental conditions. On vanishing from this world, they left behind pieces of their white gauzy robes, prints of their hands and feet, handwriting on the inner side of two slates sealed together, and finally, even let themselves be photographed. But the full impact of these tidings, impressive as they were, was not felt until the famous English physicist William Crookes, in his quarterly Journal of Science, presented to the world a report on the observations he had made during the past 8 years, which had convinced him of the reality of the phenomena in question. Since the report is concerned with observations at which none of us was present, under conditions which was no longer possible to check, we have no alternative but to let the observer himself inform us how these observations were mirrored in his brain. The tone of the report, at least, shows us to surmise the state of his feelings, and at the time of writing. I shall therefore cite verbatim a passage from his investigations during the years 1870 to 73. Class 6. The Levitation of Human Beings. This has occurred in my presence on 4 occasions in darkness. The test conditions under which they took place were quite satisfactory, so far as the judgment was concerned, but ocular demonstration of such fact is so necessary to disturb our profound opinions as to the naturally possible and impossible, that I will here only mention cases in which the deductions of reason were confirmed by the sense of sight. On one occasion, I witnessed a chair with a lady sitting on it rise several inches from the ground. On another occasion, to avoid the suspicion of this being in some way performed by herself, the lady knelt on the chair in such a manner that its 4 feet were visible to us. It then rose about 3 inches, remained suspended for about 10 seconds, and then slowly descended. At another time, 2 children, on separate occasions, rose from the floor with their chairs in full daylight, under, to me, most satisfactory conditions, for I was kneeling and keeping close watch upon the feet of the chair, and observing that no one might touch them. The most striking cases of levitation which I have witnessed have been with Mr. Home. On 3 separate occasions have I seen him raised completely from the floor of the room, once sitting in an easy chair, once kneeling on his chair, and once standing up. On each occasion, I had full opportunity of watching the occurrence as it was taking place. There are at least 100 recorded instances of Mr. Holmes rising from the ground in the presence of as many separate persons, and I have heard from the lips of the 3 witnesses to the most striking occurrence of this kind, the Earl of Dunraven, Lord Lindsay, and Captain Sewin, their own most minute accounts of what took place. To reject the recorded evidence on this subject is to reject all human testimony whatsoever. For no fact in sacred or profane history is supported by a stronger array of proofs. The accumulated testimony establishing Mr. Holmes' limitations is overwhelming. It is greatly to be desired that some person, whose evidence would be accepted as conclusive by the scientific world, if indeed there lives a person whose testimony in favor of such phenomena would be taken, would seriously and patiently examine these alleged facts. Most of the eyewitnesses to these levitations are now living and would doubtless be willing to give their evidence. But in a few years, such direct evidence will be difficult, if not impossible, to be obtained. That is still a problem we have today, right? If you are not following the correct line of research, then you don't get to follow a line of research, at least not one that'll be published. What would we know if it was actually free science? It is obvious from the tone of this passage that Crookes was completely convinced of the reality of his observations. I refrain from further quotations because they would not tell us anything new. It is sufficient to remark that Crookes saw pretty well everything that occurred with these great mediums. It is hardly necessary to stress that if this unprecedented happening is an actual fact, the world and science have been enriched by an experience of the most tremendous importance. For a variety of reasons, it is not possible to criticize Crookes's powers of apprehension and retention during those years from the psychiatric point of view. We only know that at the time, Crookes was not manifestly insane. Crookes and his observations must remain, for the present, an unsolved psychological enigma. The same is true of a number of other observers whose intelligence and honesty one does not wish to disparage without good reason. Of numerous other observers, noted for their prejudices, lack of criticism, and exuberant imagination, I shall say nothing. They are ruled out from the start. One does not have to be particularly beset by doubts as to whether our knowledge of the world in the 20th century has really attained the highest possible peak to feel humanly touched by this forthright testimony of an eminent scholar. But, in spite of our sympathy, we may leave out of account the question of the physical reality of such phenomena and instead turn our attention to the psychological question. How does a thinking person who has shown his sober mindedness and gift for scientific observation to good advantage in other fields come to assert that something inconceivable is a reality? Oh, hi, I didn't know I was getting called out today. These psychological interests of mine has prompted, I mean, really, like quite literally, I have written a book on that, right? Like the first book, A Series of Unconventional Beliefs, is me doing objectively, hopefully, the work to show how to do the inside that is entirely subjective, right? And I hope that I've shown a propensity towards sober mindedness and gift for scientific observation. Hopefully, that is something that can be observed in the things that I discuss. But I do believe, right, that something inconceivable is a reality. And so, I guess I am getting called out today. The psychological interest of mine has prompted me to keep track of persons who are gifted as mediums. My profession as a psychiatrist gives me ample opportunities for this, particularly in a city like Zurich. So many remarkable elements converging in so small a space can perhaps be found nowhere else in Europe. In the last few years, I have investigated 8 mediums, 6 of them women and 2 of them men. The total impression made by these investigations can be summed up by saying that one must approach a medium with a minimum of expectations if one does not want to be disappointed. There is an enormous glut of people that have no clue what they are talking about. Right? There are a lot of people that have consumed some really bad knowledge and they believe that they know what they are doing in a whole lot of areas and they really don't. Like really on an entirely different fundamental level of understanding just are doing it not correct. And so you really do have to be very careful, right? I believe in wild stuff, right? I believe that I have done wild stuff. And so maybe I am just as crazy as the rest of them, right? I have to keep that in mind as I am going along. But generally speaking, people who are crazy don't consider that they might be crazy. So at least I've got that going for me. The results are of purely psychological interest, and no physical or physiological novelties come to light. Everything may be considered a scientifically established fact, belongs to the domain of the mental and cerebral processes, and is fully explicable in terms of the laws already known to science. All phenomena which the spiritualists claim as evidence of the activity of spirits are connected with the presence of certain persons, the mediums themselves. That's more where I am, though, right? I do believe that there are entities, but I don't believe that they interfere a whole lot. I was never able to observe happenings alleged to be spiritual in places or on occasions when no medium was present. Mediums are, as a rule, slightly abnormal mentally. Frau Roth, for example, although she could not be declared non corpus mentis by forensic psychiatrists, nevertheless exhibited a number of hysterical symptoms. 7 of my mediums showed slight symptoms of hysteria, which, incidentally, are extraordinarily common in other walks of life, too. One medium was an American swindler whose abnormality consisted chiefly in his impotence. The other 7 acted in good faith. Only one of them, a woman of middle age, was born with her gifts. She had suffered since earliest childhood from alterations of consciousness, frequent and slightly hysterical twilight states. She made a virtue of necessity, induced the change of consciousness herself by autosuggestion, and in this state of auto-hypnosis was able to prophesy. The other mediums discovered their gift only through social contacts, and then cultivated it at spiritualistic seances, which is not particularly difficult. One can, with a few skillful suggestions, teach a remarkably high percentage of people, especially women, these simple spiritualistic manipulations, table turning, for instance, and, less commonly, automatic writing. The ordinary phenomena met with in mediums are table turning, automatic writing, and speaking in trance. That schizophrenic ego again, right? Right? Have to at least entertain the possibility. Table turning consists in one or more persons laying their hands on a table that can move easily. After a time, a couple of minutes to an hour, the table begins to move, making turning or rocking movements. This phenomenon can be observed in the case of all objects that are touched. The automatically swinging pendulum and the divining rod are based on the same principle. It was, then, a very childish hypothesis to assume, as in earlier decades, that the objects touched moved of themselves like living things. If a fairly heavy object is chosen and one feels the arm muscles of the medium while the object is moving, the muscular tension is immediately apparent, and hence also the efforts of the medium to move the object. The only remarkable thing is that the mediums assert that they feel nothing of this effort, but on the contrary, have a definite feeling that the object is moving of its own accord, or else that their arm or hand is moved for them. This psychological phenomena is strange only to people who know nothing of hypnosis. A hypnotized person can be told that, on waking, he will forget everything that happened under the hypnosis, but that at a certain sign he will, without knowing why, suddenly raise his right arm. Sure enough, on waking, he has forgotten everything. At the sign, he raises his right arm without knowing why. His arm simply rose up in the air of its own accord. Spontaneous phenomena can occasionally be observed in hysterics. For instance, the paralysis or peculiar automatic movements of an arm. Either the patients cannot give the reasons for these sudden symptoms, or they give the wrong reasons. For instance, the symptom came from their having caught cold or from overstrain. One has only to hypnotize the patient in order to discover the real reason and the significance of the symptom. For instance, a young girl wakes up in the morning to find that her right arm is paralyzed. She rushes in terror to the doctor and tells him that she doesn't know how it happened. She must obviously have overstrained herself doing the housework the day before. That is the only reason she can think of. Under hypnosis, it turns out that the day before, she had had a violent quarrel with her parents, and that her father had grabbed her by the right arm and pushed her out of the door. The paralysis of the arm is now clear. It is connected with the unconscious memory of yesterday's scene, which was not present in her waking consciousness. The existence of unconscious ideas is discussed in my paper, The Reaction Time Ratio in the Associations Experiment. Like I said yesterday, the way that I look at it is like the superconscious is the computer itself. The subconscious is the operating system, Windows, right, for most people. The unconscious is the desktop, right? It is there to access, but not necessarily active. And then the conscious is the cursor that's actually making the selections and activating the desktop. And so these unconscious ideas are like the icons that are on the desktop. It is evident from these facts that our bodies can easily execute automatic movements whose cause and origin are not known to us. And if science had not drawn our attention to it, we would not know either that our arms and hands are constantly making slight movements called intended tremors, which accompany our thoughts. If, for instance, one vividly imagines a simple geometrical figure, a triangle, say, the tremors of the outstretched hand will also describe a triangle, as can be demonstrated very easily by means of a suitable apparatus. Hence, if we sit down at a table with a lively expectation of automatic movements, the intended tremors will reflect this expectation and gradually cause the table to move. But once we have felt the apparently automatic movements, we are immediately convinced that the thing works. The conviction, suggestion, clouds our judgment and observation, so that we do not notice how the tremors, very slight at first, gradually build up into muscular contraction, which then naturally produce stronger and stronger and still more convincing effects. Now, if an ordinary table, whose simple construction we know, can execute movements apparently of its own accord and behave as if it were alive, then human fantasy is quite ready to believe that the cause of the movement is some mystic fluid or even the spirits of the air. And if, as usually happens, the table composes sentences with an intelligible content out of the letters of the alphabet, then it seems proved beyond a doubt that an alien intelligence is at work. We know, however, that the initial automatic tremors are, in large measure, dependent on our ideas. If they are capable of moving the table, they can equally well guide its movements in such a way that they construct words and sentences out of the alphabet. Nor is it necessary to visualize the sentence beforehand. The unconscious part of the psyche, which controls the automatic movements, very soon causes an intellectual content to flow into them. As might be expected, the intellectual content is, as a rule, on a very low level and only in exceptional cases exceeds the intelligence of the medium. A good example of the poverty of the table talking is given in Allan Kardec's Buch der Medien. Automatic writing follows the same principles as table turning. The content of the writing is in no way superior to that of table talking. The same considerations apply to talking in a trance or ecstasy. Instead of the muscles of the arm and hand, it is the muscles of the speech apparatus that start functioning independently. The content of trance communications is naturally on the same level as the products of other automatisms. These phenomena are statistically the ones most commonly observed in mediums. Clairvoyance is much rarer. Only two of my mediums had the reputation of being clairvoyant. One of them is a well known professional who has already made a fool of herself in various cities in Switzerland. In order to assess her mental states as fairly as possible, I had nearly 30 sittings with her over a period of 6 months. The results of the investigation, so far as clairvoyance is concerned, can be put very briefly. Nothing that quite unquestionably exceeded the normal psychological capacities was observed. On the other hand, she did in some instances display a remarkably fine gift for unconscious combination. She could combine petite perception and guesses and evaluate them in a very skillful way, mostly in a state of slight clouding of consciousness. There is nothing supernatural about this state. On the contrary, it is a well known subject of psychological research. She's probably an INFJ. How delicate is the capacity for unconscious apprehension? Jung was not an INFJ, by the way. How delicate is the capacity for an unconscious apprehension could be demonstrated experimentally with my second medium. The experiments were conducted as follows. The medium sat opposite me at a small table that stood on a thick, soft carpet to assist greater mobility. Both of us laid our hands on the table. While the medium's mind was occupied by her engaging in conversation with a third person, I thought intensively of a number between 0 and 10. For instance, 3. The arrangement was that the table had to indicate the number thought of by the same number of tilts. The fact that the number was indicated correctly each time when I kept my hands on the table throughout the experiment is not remarkable. What is remarkable is that in 77% of the cases, the correct number was also given when I removed my hands immediately after the first tilt. If my hands did not touch the table at all, there were no correct scores. The result of numerous experiments show that by means of intended tremors, it is possible to communicate a number between 0 and 10 to another person in such a way that though this person could not recognize the number, he could nevertheless reproduce it by automatic movements. I was able to establish to my satisfaction that the conscious mind of the medium never had any inkling of the number I communicated. Numbers above 10 were reproduced very uncertainly, sometimes only one of the numerals being given. If I thought of the numbers in Roman instead of Arabic numerals, the results were considerably worse. The aforesaid 77% correct scores applies only to experiments with Arabic numerals. From this, one can conclude that my unconscious movements must have communicated a pictorial image of the numbers. The more complicated and less customary images of Roman numerals fared worse, and was also the case with the numbers above 10. That is interesting. I cannot report these experiments without recalling a curious and instructive observation I made one day when all of the psychological experiments with the medium went wrong. Even the experiments with numbers failed to come off until I finally hit on the following expedient. In an experiment conducted along much the same lines, I told the medium that the number I was thinking of, 3, was between 2 and 5. I then got the table to answer me a dozen times. The number it reproduced with iron consistency were 2, 4, and 5, but never 3, thus indicating negatively but quite clearly that the table, or rather the unconscious of the medium, was well aware of the number I was thinking of and avoided it out of mere caprice. This capriciousness of the unconscious is something the spiritualists could tell us a good deal about. Only in their language it would be said that the good spirits had been supplanted by mischievous, mocking spirits who had ruined the experiment. The sensitive apprehension of the unconscious, shown by its capacity to translate another person's tremors into numbers, is a striking but by no means unprecedented fact. There are numerous corroborative examples in scientific literature, but if the unconscious, as my experiments prove, is capable of registering and reproducing something without the conscious mind knowing anything about it, then the greatest caution is necessary in evaluating clairvoyant performances. Before we jump to the conclusion that thought flies through time and space detached from the brain, we should seek to discover by meticulous psychological investigation the hidden sources of the apparently supernatural knowledge. On the other hand, any unprejudiced investigator will readily admit that we do not stand today on the pinnacle of all wisdom, and that nature still has infinite possibilities up her sleeve which may be revealed in happier days to come. I started with that. I shall therefore confine myself to pointing out that the cases I observed of supposed clairvoyance might easily be explained in another and more intelligible way than by the assumption of mystic powers of cognition. The apparently inexplicable cases of clairvoyance I know only by hearsay or have read of in books. The same is true of that other great class of spiritualistic manifestations, the physical phenomena. Those I saw were reputed to be such, but in fact were not. Generally speaking, among the countless believers in miracles of our days, very few will be found who have ever seen anything manifestly supernatural. And among these, there will be still fewer who do not suffer from an overheated imagination and do not replace critical observation by faith. Nevertheless, we are left with a residue of witnesses who ought not be cavilled at. Among these, I would include crooks. And this is another one of those things that I have healed myself. That is the thing that I fully and firmly believe was done. I did that through the manipulation of what I call the Holy Spirit. It is the electromagnetics of creation. I asked for healing. I was told, no, do it this way and you can heal yourself. And that's what I did. And it worked. Right? Me talking in the way that I'm talking right now, that is part of the proof of it. You don't have to believe it. You can go back and watch the videos. I could not talk for a couple of years. My back, doing great. My leg, wonderful. My shoulder, great. And there is physical proofs for these things. I had surgery on my shoulder. I only got 80% back. Now I've got 100. I have herniations and bulges in my spine, and they no longer affect me. I had a cyst on my vocal cords. It is gone. That is physical manifestations, in my opinion, at a very minimum. It can be entirely psychosomatic. That's going to be a really hard sell, right? Removing a lump from your throat through just deciding to is a hard sell, right? I believe that that will happen because I moved energy. Part of that is faith, part of that is taking action, part of that is following intuition. All of that is entirely subjective and should be applied with caution, right? Every single bit of it. My book is full of warnings. I give you the instructions on how I did that. And I give you all kinds of warnings. Don't do this with the wrong intentions. Don't do this if you aren't prepared to do this. And all of that. I mean, extensive warnings because you should take anything that is subjective with a grain of salt. Everything about internal reflection is entirely subjective. Everything about energetic manipulation, meditation, prayer, all of that is entirely subjective. And so nobody can tell you this is the truth. I can tell you this is what worked for me. This is the procedure that I use. These are the guidelines that I followed. Here is what I did with my life. I can tell you all of that. And you can either take that as this might work for me and I will try it, or you can completely dismiss it. Neither one of those options has any bearing on my outcome. I already have my outcome. I fully and firmly believe that it was through the will of God, and nobody else has to believe that at all. All right, back to the text. Amen indeed. All human beings are bad observers or things that are unfamiliar to them. Crooks, too, is a human being. There is no universal gift for observation that could claim a high degree of certainty without special training. Human observation achieves something only when trained in a definite field. That is definitely something, right? Like that is the phenomena of you buy a new car and you've never seen this car before, and you're like, man, that is so cool. Nobody's got that car. And then on the way home, you pass five of them, right? You see them because now your mind is trained in that direction. Part of that is the observer effect, right? You are literally creating people who have taken those options. Oh, it is definitely a whole rabbit hole to go down. Take a sensitive observer away from his microscope and turn his attention to wind and weather, and he is more helpless than any hunter or peasant. If we plump a good physicist down in the deceptive magical darkness of spiritualistic seance, with hysterical mediums plying their trade with all the incredible refinement many of them have at their command, his observation will be no more acute than a layman's. Everything will then depend on the strength of his prejudice for or against. In this respect, the psychic disposition of a man like Crookes would be worth investigating. If, as a result of environmental influence and education, or his innate temperament, he is not disinclined to believe in miracles, he will be convinced by the apparition. But if he is disinclined from the start to believe in miracles, he will remain unconvinced in spite of the apparition, just as did many other people who witnessed similar things with the same medium. And that is true as well, right? Cognitive dissonance is a thing. It is really hard to break apart the beliefs that you already hold. I mean, if something contravenes something that you hold deeply and internally, you will immediately reject it. It is human nature, right? It is only through willful effort that you are able to expend the energy that is required to take in new information for a core belief. Most people are simply unwilling to do that. And so, if it contravenes something that they hold as a core belief, you will not be able to convince them. And I've got a maxim that I like to say all of the time, directly related to that. Arguing with the willfully ignorant is like pissing in the wind. You get it out there, but you just wind up pissy. Back to the text. Human observation and reporting are subject to disturbance by countless sources of error, many of which are still quite unknown. For instance, a whole school of experimental psychology is now studying the psychology of evidence, that is, the problem of observation and reporting. Professor William Stern, the founder of this school, has published experiments which show a man's powers of observation in a bad light. And yet, Stern's experiments were conducted on educated people. It seems to me that we must go on working patiently for a few more years in the direction of the Stern School before we tackle the difficult question of the reality of spiritualistic phenomena. So far as the miraculous reports in the literature are concerned, we should, for all our criticism, never lose sight of the limitations of our knowledge. Otherwise, something embarrassingly human might happen, making us feel as foolish as the academicians. I don't know how to say that word. Academicians felt over Chladni's meteors, or the highly respected Bavarian Board of Physicians over the railway. Nevertheless, I believe that the present state of affairs gives us a reason enough to wait quietly until the more impressive physical phenomena put in an appearance. If, after making allowance for conscious and unconscious falsification, self deception, prejudice, etc., we should still find something positive behind them, then the exact sciences will surely conquer this field by experiment and verification, as has happened in every other realm of human experience. That many spiritualists brag about their science and scientific knowledge is, of course, irritating nonsense. These people are lacking not only in criticism, but in the most elementary knowledge of psychology. At bottom, they do not want to be taught any better, but merely to go on believing, surely the naivest of presumptions in view of our human failings. All right, so we are going to be moving on to the next section. That's about where I thought we would be, right at an hour. So. The psychological foundation of belief in spirits. And I'm gonna say again off the top, I believe that there are entities. I believe that there are two, at least two, planes of existence above ours. That we are on the fifth dimension of existence. That there is entities without intelligence, really, and entities with intelligence. I don't believe that they really play the part that most people give them credit for, though. Right? I don't believe that they are a direct come down and like. I had an angelic experience. That's why I say this. I was not expecting it. I was not doing anything. Right? I smoke weed, but I wasn't then. Right? And so I had an angel come down. It was a glowing light figure. It was beautiful. I couldn't describe a single feature, whether it was male or female. It said, "You will spread the word of God," and disappeared. Right? There was no interaction. There was no communication. There was no back and forth. That was it. And so I believe that they're there. I just don't believe that they really come and do the things that people give them credit for. Right? And that is true for both of those existences. And so we may not know the mechanics of it. It is still a wonderful thing to bring back the earlier discussion, but that doesn't mean that it is something that is not. Just because we don't have a explanation for it doesn't mean that it is not. And there are many things that exist outside of our current understanding that may in the future be revealed to be something that today is considered fantastical. And so, like, hypnosis at one point in time would have been fantastical. And then here is Mesmer. Ooh. All right. If we look back in the past history of mankind, we find among many other religious convictions a universal belief in the existence of phantoms or ethereal beings who dwell in the neighborhood of men and who exercise an invisible yet powerful influence upon them. These beings are generally supposed to be the spirits or souls of the dead. I think that that is only true in very rare exceptions. This belief is to be found among highly civilized people, as well as among Australian Aborigines, who are still living in the Stone Age. Among Western peoples, however, belief in spirits has been counteracted by the rationalism and scientific enlightenment of the last 150 years, so that among the majority of educated people today, it has been suppressed, along with other metaphysical beliefs. But just as these beliefs are still alive among the masses, so too is the belief in spirits. The haunted house has not yet become extinct, even in the most enlightened and the most intellectual cities, nor has the peasant ceased to believe in the bewitching of his cattle. On the contrary, in this age of materialism, the inevitable consequence of rationalistic enlightenment, there has been a revival in the belief in spirits, but this time on a higher level. It is not a relapse into the darkness of superstition, but an intense scientific interest, a need to direct the searchlight of truth onto the chaos of dubious facts. The names of Crookes, Myers, Wallace, Zollner, and many other eminent men symbolize this rebirth and rehabilitation of the belief in spirits. Even if the real nature of their observations can be disputed, even if they can be accused of errors and self-deception. These investigators have still earned for themselves the undying moral merit of having thrown the full weight of their authority and of their great scientific name into these endeavors to shed fresh light on the darkness, regardless of all personal fears and considerations. They shrank neither from academic prejudice nor from the derision of the public, and at the very time when the thinking of educated people was more than ever spellbound by materialistic dogmas, they drew the attention to phenomena of psychic provenance that seemed to be in complete contradiction to the materialism of their age. These men typify the reaction of the human mind against the materialistic view of the world. Looked at from the historical standpoint, it is not at all surprising that they use the belief in spirits as the most effective weapon against the mere truth of the senses. For belief in spirits has the same functional significance also for primitive man. His utter dependence on circumstances and environment, the manifold distresses and tribulations of his life, surrounded by hostile neighbors, dangerous beasts of prey, and often exposed to the pitiless forces of nature. His keen senses, his cupidity, his uncontrolled emotions, all these things bind him to the physical realities so that he is in constant danger of adopting a purely materialistic attitude and becoming degenerate. His belief in spirits, or rather, his awareness of a spiritual world, pulls him again and again out of that bondage in which his senses would hold him. It forces on him the certainty of a spiritual reality, whose laws he must observe as carefully and as guardedly as the laws of his physical environment. Primitive man, therefore, really lives in two worlds. Physical reality is at the same time spiritual reality. The physical world is undeniable, and for him, the world of spirits has an equally real existence. Not just because he thinks so, but because of his naive awareness of things spiritual. Wherever this naivete is lost through contact with civilization and its disastrous enlightenment, he forfeits this dependence on spiritual law and accordingly degenerates. Even Christianity gains saving from corruption, for a highly developed religion like Christianity demands a highly developed psyche if its beneficial effects are to be felt. For the primitive, the phenomena of spirits is direct evidence for the reality of a spiritual world. If we inquire what these spirit phenomena mean to him and in what they consist, we find that the most frequent phenomena is the seeing of apparitions or ghosts. It is generally assumed that the seeing of apparitions is far commoner among primitives than among civilized people. The inference being that this is nothing but superstition, because civilized people do not have such visions unless they are ill. It is quite certain that civilized man makes much less use of the hypothesis of spirits than the primitive, but in my view, it is equally certain that psychic phenomena occur no less frequently with civilized people than they do with primitives. The only difference is that where the primitive speaks of ghosts, the European speaks of dreams and fantasies and neurotic symptoms and attributes less importance to them than the primitive does. I am convinced that if a European had to go through the same exercises and ceremonies which the medicine man performs in order to make the spirits visible, he would have the same experiences. He would interpret them differently, of course, and devalue them, and this would not alter the facts as such. It is well known that Europeans have very curious psychic experiences if they have to live under primitive conditions for a long time, or if they find themselves in some other unusual psychological situation. One of the most important sources of primitive beliefs in spirits is dreams. People very often appear as the actors in dreams, and the primitive readily believes them to be spirits or ghosts. The dream has, for him, an incomparably higher value than it has for civilized man. Not only does he talk a great deal about his dreams, he also attributes an extraordinary importance to them, so that it often seems as though he were unable to distinguish between them and reality. To the civilized man, dreams appear, as a rule, appear valueless, though there are some people who attach great significance to certain dreams on account of their weird and impressive character. I very rarely remember a dream. If I do, it generally does have some significance, like external from me, even. This peculiarity lends plausibility to the view that dreams are inspirations, but inspiration implies something that inspires, a spirit or a ghost, although this logical inference is not likely to appeal to the modern mind. A good instance of this is the fact that the dead sometimes appear in dreams. The primitive naively takes them for revenants. Another source of the belief in spirits is psychogenic diseases, nervous disorders, especially those of an hysterical character, which are not rare among primitives. Since these illnesses stem from psychic conflicts, mostly unconscious, it seems to the primitive that they are caused by certain persons, living or dead, who are in some way connected with this subjective conflict. If the person is dead, it is naturally assumed that his spirit is having an injurious influence. As pathogenic conflicts usually go back to childhood and are connected with memories of the parents, we can understand why the primitive attaches special importance to the spirits of dead relatives. This accounts for the wide incidence of ancestor worship, which is primarily a protection against the malice of the dead. Anyone who has had experience of nervous illness knows how great is the importance of parental influences on patients. Many patients feel persecuted by their parents long after they are dead. The psychological after effects of the patient parents are so powerful that many cultures have developed a whole system of ancestor worship to propitiate them. There can be no doubt that mental illness plays a significant part in causing belief in spirits. Among primitive peoples, these illnesses, so far as is known, are mostly of a delirious, hallucinatory, or catatonic nature, belonging apparently to the broad domain of schizophrenia, an illness which covers the great majority of chronically insane patients. In all ages and all over the world, insane people have been regarded as possessed by evil spirits, and this belief is supported by the patient's own hallucinations. The patients are tormented less by visions than by auditory hallucinations. They hear voices. Very often, these voices are those of relatives or of some person in some way connected with the patient's conflicts. To the naive mind, the hallucinations naturally appear to be caused by spirits. It is impossible to speak of belief in spirits without at the same time considering the belief in souls. Belief in souls is a correlate to belief in spirits, since, according to primitive belief, a spirit is usually the ghost of one dead. It must once have been the soul of a living person. This is particularly the case wherever the beliefs held that people have only one soul. But this assumption does not prevail everywhere. It is frequently supposed that people have two or more souls, one of which survives death and is immortal. In this case, the spirit of the dead is only one of the several souls of the living. It is thus only a part of the total soul, a psychic fragment, so to speak. I am unaware of that, right? I My understanding is that we are all from the one, right? We all come from God as individual expressions, as individualized slices of the divinity to have an experience for the divine that the divine can't have because the divine doesn't know grief. You return to the divine. The divine doesn't really know joy because that is a celebration type thing that he already knows the outcome of. And so, in order to have the experience, we are here. And much like schizophrenia, right? We are individual users of the computer. Right? We are controlling the mouse, but we each have our individual desktops and are not really, but kind of the subconscious, but even less so the superconscious. The superconscious and the collective unconscious are fairly close to the same thing. They are different expressions of the same idea. And so the computer itself is the superconscious, which is the shared resource. That would be the one in the manifest way, right? The earth. And then you have the subconscious, which is the operating system, which is a commonality, right? We are all here in this 5D experience having an experience, even though those individual experiences differentiate, we're running on the same program. Gravity, electromagnetism, right? Light, and all of these things, they're commonalities. That is closer to the subconscious. The individual desktop is your expression of the unconscious, right? You draw upon the subconscious to create your unconscious, from which is a resource your conscious can use. And so we are all like individual accounts on the Windows operating system. Schizophrenia appears to be somewhat of a slipping of permissions between those accounts. And so instead of completely separate accounts, there's some bleed over. And sometimes you're getting more of this kernel, and sometimes you're getting more of this kernel, but you have access to too many accounts, right? And so the spirits of the dead, as there being more than one soul, is a completely foreign concept to me, right? That there's a spirit of the dead and of the living, as there are two souls residing in the same body. This is something that I'm completely unfamiliar with. Have two or more souls. Interesting. Anyway, back to the text. Belief in souls is therefore a necessary premise for belief in spirits, at least so far as the spirits of the dead are concerned. However, primitives do not believe only in spirits of the dead. There are also elemental demons who are supposed never to have been human souls or soul parts. This group of spirits must therefore have a different origin. I have a whole theory. It's in the book. I have playlists. So before going into the psychological grounds for belief in souls, I should like to take a quick glance back at the facts already mentioned. I have pointed out three main sources that put the belief in spirits on a solid foundation: the seeing of apparitions, dreams, and pathological disturbances of psychic life. The commonest and most normal of these phenomena is the dream, and its great significance for primitive psychology is now widely recognized. What then is a dream? Perhaps the splitting of one's soul, dualism blind by dividing in that manner. Yeah, I guess. Like, it's really hard for me to conceptualize. Like that would be like all of the souls residing inside of the schizophrenic, and they have literally more than one soul. Like, who has control over that? And I mean, even the splitting of one soul wouldn't actually be two souls. Like, I would really like to know the source of that, and I don't know that he's got it footnoted correctly, so I may not. But uh that's just an interesting concept that I've never considered, right? That there might be more than one version of the soul, Like, that's a completely different concept of the soul than what I have entirely. The dream is a psychic product originating in the sleeping state without conscious motivation. In a dream, consciousness is not completely extinguished. There is always a small remnant left. In most dreams, for instance, there is still some consciousness of the ego, although it is a very limited and curiously distorted ego known as the dream ego. It is a mere fragment or shadow of the waking ego. Consciousness exists only when the psychic contents are associated with the ego, and the ego is a psychic complex of a particularly solid kind. As sleep is seldom quite dreamless, we may assume that the activity of the ego complex seldom ceases entirely. Its activity is, as a rule, only restricted by sleep. The psychic contents associated with it in a dream confront the ego in much the same way as do the outward circumstances in real life, so that in dreams we generally find ourselves in situations such as we could not conceive when awake, but which are very like situations we are confronted with in reality. As in our waking state, the real people and things enter our field of vision, so the dream images enter like another kind of reality into the field of consciousness of the dream ego. We do not feel as if we were producing the dreams. It is rather as if the dreams came to us. They are not subject to our control, but obey their own laws. They are obviously autonomous psychic complexes which form themselves out of their own material. We do not know the source of their motives, and we therefore say that dreams come from the unconscious. In saying this, we assume that there are independent psychic complexes which elude our conscious control and come and go according to their own laws. In our waking life, we imagine we make our own thoughts and we can have them when we want. We also think we know where they come from and why and to what end we have them. Whenever a thought comes to us against our will or suddenly vanishes against our will, we feel as if something exceptional or even morbid had happened. The difference between psychic activity in the waking and in the sleeping state seems, therefore, to be an important one. In the waking state, the psyche is apparently under control of the conscious will, but in the sleeping state, it produces contents that are strange and incomprehensible, as though they came from another world. The same is true of visions. They are like dreams, only they occur in the waking state. They enter consciousness along with conscious perceptions and are nothing other than the momentary eruption of unconscious content. The same phenomena also happens in mental disturbances, quite out of the blue, apparently, against the background of noises in the environment and sound waves coming from outside. The ear, excited from within, hears psychic contents that have nothing to do with the immediate concerns of the conscious mind. Besides judgments formed by intellect and feeling from definite premises, opinions and convictions thrust themselves on the patient, apparently deriving from real perceptions, but actually from unconscious factors within him. These are delusional ideas. Bipolar disorder similarities, I'd imagine, because of ego blocks. I agree. Yeah, yeah. Common to all three types of phenomena is the fact that the psyche is not an indivisible unity, but a divisible and more or less divided whole. There are four parts, although the separate parts are connected with one another. They are relatively independent, so much so that certain parts of the psyche never become associated with the ego at all, or only very rarely. I have called these psychic fragments autonomous complexes, and I based my theory of complexes on their existence. A good way to understand complexes in a non conceptual way, I, if somebody was to throw a ball at you and you instinctually just reach out and grab it through muscle memory and reflex, that is the way that an autonomous complex will just grab you, right? Like you respond in a way that you don't even consciously think about. And so just so that that is explained in a slightly different way, right? It's just like using the sleeping mind to catch the ball. If I can tell you I'm going to throw this ball, you cannot make the calculation on where it's going to land. But if I throw the ball within milliseconds, you know exactly where it's going to land. And that is how autonomous complexes work. They just work on the conceptualized side of things as opposed to the physicality. According to this theory, the ego complex forms the center characteristic of our psyche, but it is only one among several complexes. The others are more often than not associated with the ego complex and in this way become conscious. But they can also exist for some time without being associated with it. An excellent and very well known example of this is the conversion of St. Paul. Although the actual moment of conversion often seems quite sudden and unexpected, we know from experience that such a fundamental upheaval always requires a long period of incubation. It is only when this preparation is complete, that is to say, when the individual is ripe for conversion, that the new insight breaks through with violent emotion. I agree with that. I do. There is no change that comes completely unbidden from yourself, right? You have to get tired of it before you will change it, generally speaking. For me, that was like I just had the memory pop up of me and my wife dancing in the living room in January of 2019. That was before I quit smoking. That was before I started walking. That was before I had finally had enough of me that I started doing the things that led to me being where I am at. But at that point, I was already fed up with smoking. I was already fed up with being overweight, not being able to do things. And so it took a moment of collapse before it finally got to the point. And really, like, I gave up smoking for my children, right? That was a Father's Day gift for my children in 2019. But the walking really was the outflow of getting sick, right? If I had not gave up smoking due to my intuition in June of 2019, then I probably would have died in October of 2019. The illness that I got, everybody else got it a couple months later. It shut down the whole world, right? I almost died. It was very close. Nobody in my household knew how close it was. I wasn't able to breathe with any reliability for a couple of months. I couldn't walk from my couch to my door without getting out of breath. And that was really what spurred me to begin my walks. And so there really does have to come some point of collapse before you will change yourself in that way. Saul, as he was then called, had unconsciously been a Christian for a long time, and this would explain his fanatical hatred of the Christians, because fanaticism is always found in those who have to stifle a secret doubt. That is most certainly an assumption. You do not have textual confirmation of that. You absolutely did not have firsthand knowledge of that. Probably nobody did. And so we'll leave that. That is why converts who are always the worst fanatics. But that is absolute truth, right? Nobody is harder on somebody than somebody that used to, right? The common thing is nobody's harder on a whore than an ex whore or an addict than an ex addict. You will give them the most shit to the people that you are the closest associated with. That's why I can give so much shit to everybody. The vision of Christ on the road to Damascus, was it Christ though? Merely marks the moment when the unconscious Christ complex associated itself with Paul's ego. There you go. You got something on that. The fact that Christ appeared to him objectively in the form of a vision is explained by the circumstance that Saul's Christianity was an unconscious complex which appeared to him in projection as if it did not belong to him. Okay, but it was not objective, right? It was subjective, right? There is no consistent account of it. There is actually like three different accounts given by the people associated with it. Right? One, everybody saw the light, but nobody heard the voice but me. And then the another one was, everybody heard the voice, but only I understood it. And the other one was nobody saw anything. Right? All three of those accounts are in the book. They are completely contradictory to one another, and the only way that you can reconcile those three accounts is if you are looking in the way that has already been described to confirm what you already believe to the point where you refuse to believe anything else. The book is completely filled with that. And there is no good reason to believe that Paul actually had an experience with Jesus. There's not, because he went on a mission and he completely overrode every single apostle that ever stood at the feet of Jesus in his doctrine that he was giving people. It doesn't comport with the teachings of Christ at all. So you can make the argument that he had a vision, that he was feeling guilty, that he wanted to be a Christian. You can make those arguments, but you're going to have a really hard sell saying that Jesus appeared to him. He could not see himself as a Christian, therefore, from sheer resistance to Christ, he became blind and could only be healed again by a Christian. We know that psychogenic blindness is always an unconscious unwillingness to see, which in Saul's case corresponds with his fanatical resistance to Christianity. This resistance, as we know from the epistles, was never entirely overcome, and occasionally it broke out in the form of fits, which were erroneously explained as epileptic. The fits were a sudden return of the old Saul complex, which had been split off by his conversion just as the Christ complex was before. Paul as a schizophrenic was not on my bingo card. But apparently, for reasons of intellectual morality, we should not explain Paul's conversion on metaphysical grounds. Otherwise, we should have to explain all similar cases that occur among our patients in the same metaphysical way. This would lead to quite absurd conclusions, repugnant to reason and feeling alike. That is understandable, right? The story of the three Jesuses. Autonomous complexes appear most clearly in dreams, visions, pathological hallucinations, and delusional ideas. Because the ego is unconscious of them, they always appear first in projected form. In dreams, they are represented by other people. In visions, they are projected, as it were, into space, just like the voices in insanity when not ascribed to persons in the patient's environment. Ideas of persecution, as we know, are frequently associated with particular persons to whom the patient attributes the peculiarities of his own unconscious complex. That that is the targeted individual syndrome, right? The government is watching me, man. There's a car that drove through my neighborhood 4 times this week. It's watching me, man. There's a van parked 5 miles down the road. They've got a telescopic lens and they're watching me, man. I would call some names, but I'm not going to do that. He feels these persons as hostile because he is hostile to the unconscious complex. Just as Saul resented the Christ complex, he could not acknowledge in himself and persecuted the Christians as its representatives. We see this constantly repeated in everyday life. People unhesitatingly project their own assumptions about others onto the persons concerned and hate or love them accordingly. Since reflection is so troublesome and difficult, they prefer to judge without restraint, not realizing that they are merely projecting and making themselves as the victims of a stupid illusion. Boy, oh boy. They take no account of the injustice and uncharitableness of such a procedure, and above all, they never consider the serious loss of personality they suffer when, from sheer negligence, they allow themselves the luxury of foisting their own mistakes or merits onto others. It is exceedingly unwise to think that other people are as stupid and inferior as one is oneself. And one should also realize the damage one does by assigning one's own good qualities to the moral highwayman with an eye to the main chance. Spirits, therefore, viewed from the psychological angle, are unconscious autonomous complexes which appear as projections because they have no direct association with the ego. I said earlier on that belief in souls is a necessary correlate of belief in spirits. While spirits are felt to be strange and as not belonging to the ego, this is not true of the soul or souls. The primitive feels the proximity of the influence of a spirit as something uncanny or dangerous and is greatly relieved when the spirit is banished. Conversely, he feels the loss of a soul as if it were a sickness. Indeed, he often attributes serious physical diseases to loss of soul. There are innumerable rites for calling the soul bed back to the sick person. Children may not be struck because their souls might feel insulted and depart. Thus, for the primitive, the soul is something that seems normally to belong to him, but spirits to be something that normally should not be near him. He avoids places haunted by spirits or visits them only with fear for religious or magical purposes. The plurality of souls indicates a plurality of relatively autonomous complexes that can behave like spirits. The soul complexes seem to belong to the ego, and the loss of them appears pathological. The opposite is true of spirit complexes. Their association with the ego causes illness, and their dissociation from it brings recovery. Accordingly, primitive pathology recognizes two causes of illness: loss of soul and possession by a spirit. The two theories keep one another more or less balanced. We therefore have to postulate the existence of unconscious complexes that normally belong to the ego and of those that normally should not become associated with it. The former are the soul complexes, the latter, the spirit complexes. This distinction, common to the most primitive beliefs, corresponds exactly to my conception of the unconscious. According to my view, the unconscious falls into two parts which should be sharply distinguished from one another. One is the personal unconscious. It includes all those psychic contents which have been forgotten during the course of the individual's life. Traces of them still preserved in the unconscious, even if all conscious memory of them has been lost. In addition, it contains all the subliminal impressions or perceptions which have too little energy to reach consciousness. And again, the desktop is not a bad for this, right? Traces of them still preserved in the unconscious is all of those icons that you haven't used in 2 years. I've got several of them on my desktop, right? And so it's not hard to draw that correlative for that. To these, we must add unconscious combinations of ideas that are still too feeble and too indistinct to cross over the threshold. Finally, the personal unconscious contains all psychic contents that are incompatible with the conscious attitude. This comprises a whole group of contents, chiefly those which appear morally, aesthetically, or intellectually inadmissible, and are repressed on account of their incompatibility. A man cannot always think and feel the good and true and the beautiful, and in trying to keep up an ideal attitude, everything that does not fit in with it is automatically repressed. If, as is nearly always the case in a differentiated person, one function, for instance, thinking, is especially developed and dominates consciousness, then feeling is thrust into the background and largely falls into the unconscious. I agree, right? And this is leading directly into the MBTI stuff. Now, I have completely reworked the way that MBTI, the outflow of it is, but this is foundational stuff that is not changed in what I do, right? Thinking and feeling are two of the variables, right? And there is definitely a difference, right? You see, some people are very much given away to their feelings, the hippy dippy type. Those people are very much feelers. But then you have the very scientific types that will not acknowledge that there is any feelings available. And so it really is a way to differentiate the way of thinking. I do have an entire playlist to that. And the green stone, we talk about that quite a lot. The other part of the unconscious is what I call the impersonal collective or collective unconscious. And as the name indicates, its contents are not personal but collective. That is, they do not belong to one individual alone, but to a whole group of individuals and generally to a whole nation, or even to the whole of mankind. These contents are not acquired during the individual's lifetime, but are products of innate forms and instincts. Although the child possesses no inborn ideas, it nevertheless has a highly developed brain which functions in a quite definite way. This brain is inherited from its ancestors. It is the deposit of the psychic functioning of the whole human race. The child, therefore, brings with it an organ ready to function in the same way it has functioned throughout human history. In the brain, the instincts are preformed, so that the primordial images, which have always been the basis of man's thinking, the whole treasure house of mythological motifs. This is Windows, right? This is the operating system. This is not the superconscious, which is the structure from which it is built and recorded into, but the actual thing that is working and moving and supplying this stuff to your unconscious to go into your consciousness. It is, of course, not easy to prove the existence of the collective unconscious in a normal person, but occasionally mythological ideas are represented in his dreams. The best way to explain this are primal fears, right? The primal fear of snakes, the primal fear of spiders, the primal fear of scorpions. These are things that even if you have never been presented with a snake, the first time that you see a snake, you're going to be like, now, you may overcome that and you may find that to be an attraction for snakes, right? You may misinterpret that instinctual response as an attraction for snakes, and that explains the people that love snakes and love spiders, right? They feel that on a primal level and they misinterpret it, generally speaking, into something that probably is a little bit not the best for them. But that's a good way of looking at it, right? The primal instincts are breathing, eating, right? These things are, you don't need an instruction manual. You will figure it out. Uh, and that includes most of the instinctual responses. So but that is written in Windows, right? As opposed to being on the desktop, that is written in the program itself. These contents can be seen most clearly in cases of mental derangement, especially in schizophrenia, where mythological images often pour out in astonishing variety. Insane people frequently produce combinations of ideas and symbols that could never be accounted for by experiences in their individual lives, but only by the history of the human mind. It is an instance of primitive mythological thinking, which reproduces its own primordial images and is not a reproduction of conscious experiences. The personal unconscious, then, contains complexes that belong to the individual and form an intrinsic part of his psychic life. When any complex, which ought to be associated with the ego, becomes unconscious, either by being repressed or by sinking below the threshold, the individual experiences a sense of loss. Conversely, when a lost complex is made conscious again, for instance, through psychotherapeutic treatment, he experiences an increase in power. That is true. Many neuroses are cured in this way. But when, on the other hand, a complex of the collective unconscious becomes associated with the ego, an example becomes conscious, it is felt as strange, uncanny, and at the same time, fascinating. At all the events, at all events, the conscious mind falls under its spell, either feeling it as something pathological or else being alienated by it from normal life. The association of a collective content with the ego always produces the state of alienation because something is added to the individual's consciousness, which ought really to remain unconscious, that is, separated from the ego. If the content can be removed from the consciousness again, the patient will feel relieved and more normal. The eruption of these alien contents is a characteristic symptom marking the onset of many mental illnesses. The patients are seized by weird and monstrous thoughts. The whole world seems changed. People have horrible, distorted faces, and so on. While the contents of the personal unconscious are felt as belonging to one's own psyche, the contents of the collective unconscious seem alien, as if they came from the outside. The reintegration of a personal complex has the effect of release and often of healing, whereas the invasion of a complex from the collective unconscious is a very disagreeable and even dangerous phenomenon. The parallel with the primitive belief in souls and spirits is obvious. Souls correspond to the autonomous complexes of the personal unconscious, and spirits to those of the collective unconscious. We, from the scientific standpoint, prosaically call the awful beings that dwell in the shadows of the primeval forests psychic complexes. Yet, if we consider the extraordinary role played by the belief in souls and spirits in the history of mankind, we cannot be content with merely establishing the existence of such complexes, but must go rather more deeply into their nature. These complexes can be easily demonstrated by means of the association experiment. The procedure is simple. The experimenter calls out a word to the test person, and the test person reacts as quickly as possible with the first word that comes into his mind. The reaction time is measured by a stopwatch. One would expect all simple words to be answered with roughly the same speed, and that only difficult words would be followed by a prolonged reaction time. But actually, this is not so. There are unexpectedly prolonged reaction times after very simple words, whereas difficult words may be answered quite quickly. Closer investigation shows that prolonged reaction times generally occur when stimulus word hits a content with a strong feeling tone. Besides the prolonged reaction time, there are other characteristic disturbances that cannot be discussed in detail here. The feeling tone contents generally have to do with things which the test person would like to keep secret, painful things which he has repressed, some of them being unknown even to the test person himself. When a stimulus word hits such a complex, no answer occurs to him at all, or else so many things crowd into his mind that he does not know what answer to give, or he as mechanically repeats the stimulus word, or he gives an answer and then immediately substitutes another, and so forth. When, after completing the experiment, the test person is asked what answers he gave to the individual words, we find that ordinary reactions are remembered quite well, while words connected with a complex are usually forgotten. These peculiarities plainly reveal the qualities of autonomous complex. It creates a disturbance in the readiness to react, either inhibiting the answer or causing an undue delay, or it produces an unsuitable reaction and afterwards often suppresses the memory of an answer. It interferes with the conscious will and disturbs its intentions. That is why we call it autonomous. If we subject a neurotic or insane person to this experiment, we find that the complexes which disturb the reactions are at the same time essential components of the psychic disturbance. They cause not only the disturbances of reaction, but also the symptoms. I have seen cases where certain stimulus words were followed by strange and apparently nonsensical answers, by words that came out of the test person's mouth quite unexpectedly, as though a strange being had spoken through him. These words belong to the autonomous complex. When excited by an external stimulus, complexes can produce sudden confusions or violent effects, depressions, anxiety states, etc., or they may express themselves in hallucinations. In short, they behave in such a way that the primitive theory of spirits strikes one as being an uncommonly apt formulation for them. We may carry this parallel further. Certain complexes arrive on account of painful or distressing experiences in a person's life, experiences of an emotional nature which leave lasting psychic wounds behind them. A bad experience of this sort often crushes valuable qualities in an individual. All these produce unconscious complexes of a personal nature. A primitive would rightly speak of a loss of soul because certain portions of the psyche have indeed disappeared. A great many autonomous complexes arise in this way, but there are others that come from quite a different source. While the first source is easily understood since it concerns the outward life everyone can see, this other source is obscure and difficult to understand because it has to do with perceptions or impressions of the collective unconscious. Usually, the individual tries to rationalize these inner perceptions in terms of external causes, but that does not get at the root of the matter. At bottom, they are irrational contents of which the individual had never been conscious before, and which he therefore vainly seeks to discover somewheres outside him. The primitive expresses this very aptly when he says that some spirit is interfering with him. So far as I can judge, these experiences occur either when something so devastating happens to the individual that his whole previous attitude of life breaks down, or when for some reason the contents of the collective unconscious accumulate so much energy that they start influencing the conscious mind. In my view, this happens when the life of a large social group or a nation undergoes a profound change of a political, social, or religious nature. Such a change always involves an alteration of the psychological attitude. Incisive changes in history are generally attributed exclusively to external causes. It seems to me, however, that external circumstances often serve merely as occasions for a new attitude to life and the world, long prepared in the unconscious to become manifest. Social, political, and religious conditions affect the collective unconscious in the sense that all those factors which are suppressed by the prevailing views or attitudes in the life of a society gradually accumulate in the collective unconscious and activate its contents. Certain individuals, gifted with particularly strong intuition, then become aware of the changes going on in it and translate these changes into communicable ideas. The new ideas spread rapidly because parallel changes have been taking place in the unconscious of other people. There is a general readiness to accept the new ideas, although, on the other hand, they often meet with violent resistance. New ideas are not just the enemies of the old, they also appear as a rule in an extremely unacceptable form. Whenever contents of the collective unconscious become activated, they have the disturbing effect on the conscious mind, and confusion ensues. If the activation is due to the collapse of the individual's hopes and expectations, there is a danger that the collective unconscious may take the place of reality. This state would be pathological. If, on the other hand, the activation is the result of psychological processes in the unconscious of the people, the individual may feel threatened or at any rate disoriented, but the resultant state is not pathological, at least so far as the individual is concerned. Nevertheless, the mental state of the people as a whole might well be compared to a psychosis. As psychosis, mass formation psychosis, that is a thing. If the translation of the unconscious in a communicable language proves successful, it has a redeeming effect. The driving forces locked up in the unconscious are canalized into consciousness and form a new source of power, which may, however, unleash a dangerous enthusiasm. Spirits are not, under all circumstances, dangerous and harmful. They can, when translated into ideas, also have beneficial effects. A well known example of this transformation of a content of the collective unconscious into communicable language is the miracle of Pentecost. From the point of view of the onlookers, the apostles were in a state of ecstatic intoxication. These men are full of new wine, Acts 2:13. But it was just when they were in the state that they communicated the new teaching, which gave expression to the unconscious expectations of the people and spread with astonishing rapidity through the whole Roman Empire. Spirits are complexes for the collective unconscious, which appear when the individual loses his adaptation to reality, or which seek to replace the inadequate attitude of a whole people by a new one. They are, therefore, either pathological fantasies or new but as yet unknown ideas. The psychogenesis of the spirits of the dead seems to me to be more or less as follows. When a person dies, the feelings and emotions that bound his relatives to him lose their application to reality and sink into the unconscious, where they activate a collective content that has a deleterious effect on consciousness. The Bataks and many other primitives, therefore, say that when a man dies, his character deteriorates, so that he is always trying to harm the living in some way. This view is obviously based on the experience that a persistent attachment to the dead makes life seem less worth living and may even be the cause of psychic illnesses. This is something else that can be witnessed, right? People do tend to latch onto an event. And I can pull an example from my own life, right? My uncle James died young. He was 32 or 33 years old, I believe, and he died from a heroin overdose. My grandmother, every single day for the rest of her entire life, dealt with that in a very real way without ever dealing with that in any real way, right? Her life constantly revolved around the fact that her son had died. She was never able to progress forward from that. That willing attachment to the loss, which is what that is, you are willingly choosing not to move on, leads to many other psychic problems, right? High blood pressure, insomnia, all of these things can be outflows of holding on to someone that has passed on. The harmful effect shows itself in the form of loss of libido, depression, and physical debility. There you go. There are also universal reports of these post-mortem phenomena in the form of ghosts and hauntings. They are based on, in the main, on psychic facts which cannot be dismissed out of hand. Very often, the fear of superstition, which, strangely enough, is the concomitant of universal enlightenment, is responsible for the hasty suppression of extremely interesting factual reports, which are thus lost to science. I have not only found many reports of this kind among my patients, but have also observed a few things myself. But my material is too slender for me to base any verifiable hypothesis on it. Nevertheless, I am myself convinced that ghosts and such like have to do with psychic facts of which our academic wisdom refuses to take cognizance, although they appear clearly enough in our dreams. In this essay, I have sketched out a psychological interpretation of the problem of spirits from the standpoint of our present knowledge of unconscious processes. I have confined myself wholly to the psychological side of the problem and purposely avoided the question of whether spirits exist in themselves and can give evidence of their existence through material effects. I avoid this question not because I regard it as futile from the start, but because I am not in a position to adduce experiences that would prove it one way or the other. I think the reader will be as conscious as I am that it is extraordinarily difficult to find reliable evidence for the independent existence of spirits, since the usual spiritualistic communications are, as a rule, nothing but very ordinary products of the personal unconscious. There are, nevertheless, a few exceptions worth mentioning. I would like to call attention to the remarkable case, Stuart E. White, as described in a number of books. Here, the communications have a much profounder content than usual. For instance, a great many archetypal ideas were produced, among them the archetype of the self, so that one might almost think that there had been borrowings from my writings. If we discount the possibility of conscious plagiarism, I should say that cryptomnesic reproduction is very unlikely. It appears to be a case of genuine, spontaneous production of a collective archetype. This is not in itself anything extraordinary, since the archetype of the self is met with everywhere in mythology, as well as in the products of individual fantasy. The spontaneous eruption of the collective contents, whose existence in the unconscious has long been known to psychology, is part of the general tendency of mediumistic communications to filter the contents of the unconscious through the consciousness. I have studied a wide range of spiritualistic literature precisely for these tendencies and have come to the conclusion that in spiritualism we have a spontaneous attempt of the unconscious to become conscious in a collective form. The psychotherapeutic endeavors of these so called spirits are aimed at the living, either directly or indirectly through the deceased person, in order to make them more conscious. Spiritualism as a collective phenomenon thus pursues the same goals as medical psychology, and in so doing, as in this case, the same basic ideas and images, styling themselves the teachings of the spirits, which are characteristic of the nature of the collective unconscious. Such things, however baffling they may be, prove nothing either for or against the hypotheses of spirit. But it is a very different matter when we come to proving cases of identity. I shall not commit the fashionable stupidity of regarding everything I cannot explain as a fraud. There are probably very few proofs of this kind which could stand up to the test of cryptomnesia and, above all, of extrasensory perception. Science cannot afford the luxury of naivete in these matters. Nevertheless, I would recommend anyone who is interested in the psychology of the unconscious to read the books of Stuart White. The most interesting to my mind is The Unobstructed Universe, 1940, The Road I Know, 1942. It is also remarkable in that it serves as an admirable introduction to the method of active imagination, which I have been using for more than 30 years in the treatment of neuroses as a means of bringing unconscious contents to consciousness. In all these books, you still find the primitive equation spirit land equals dreamland, the unconscious. The parapsychic phenomenon seems to be connected as a rule with the presence of a medium. They are, so far as my experience goes, the exteriorized effects of unconscious complexes. I, for one, am certainly convinced that they are exteriorizations. I have repeatedly observed the telepathic effects of unconscious complexes and also a number of parapsychic phenomena. But in all this, I see no proof whatever of the existence of real spirits, and until such proof is forthcoming, I must regard this whole territory as an appendix of psychology. I think science has to impose this restriction on itself. Yet, one should never forget that science is simply a matter of intellect, and that the intellect is only one among several fundamental psychic functions, and therefore does not suffice to give a complete picture of the world. For this, another function, feeling, is needed too. Feeling often arrives at convictions that are different from those of the intellect, and we cannot always prove what the convictions of feeling are necessarily inferior. We also have subliminal perceptions of the unconscious, which are not at the disposal of the intellect and are therefore missing in a purely intellectual picture of the world. So we have every reason to grant our intellect only a limited validity. And when we work with the intellect, we must proceed scientifically and adhere to empirical principles until irrefutable evidence against their validity is forthcoming. And that's going to bring us to the end, but we will be back tomorrow with the soul and death. Hopefully, I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat difficult topics. I know I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional. It is not something I apologize for. I don't think I stepped on, well, I probably did. I probably did step on some toes. Regardless, I feel like I explained my points fairly well. If any of it is confusing to you, however, I do have several playlists linked in the box down below. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree, put it in the box, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you've truly found value, I ask that you give me a super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of any one of my books, or reaching out to me through the the links provided down below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me. Oh, hey, Jason. Yeah, I'm trying to be here every morning from 8 to 10, and I have to stop because my dogs need to go out. So, uh, but I will be here if you are interested. Like, we're doing the soul and death tomorrow. That is probably going to be a lively discussion. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pittstake. Peace. Thank you, Lord.